Welcome back. We've got a really fascinating deep dive lined up for you today, all about the Mandarin language. And let me tell you, after digging through the research you sent over, I'm realizing there's way more to this language than meets the ear.
You're definitely right about that. Most people hear Mandarin and they think of it as one single language.
Right, just one thing.
But we're really talking about a whole family of languages here.
Like, whoa, it's a family reunion. It reminds me of when people say Spanish, but they could be talking about anything from what you hear in Spain to dialects in Latin America that would probably have even, like a 16th century Spaniard, totally lost.
Exactly. It's all about how the word has changed over time,
Yeah.
how it's connected to both how people actually speak Hindi, who's been in charge through the centuries.
It's amazing how much history gets baked into language. So where do we even start with Mandarin? Where does this massive family come from?
Well, if we want to really understand it, we got to rewind a bit, go back in time. See, China has always had this incredible variety of dialects, each with its own history.
Like different flavors of language all mixed in together.
I like that. Different flavors, different regions, all developing over centuries. But then, as China started forming into these powerful empires, you can imagine, they needed a way for everyone to talk to each other. Officials from different parts of the country had to be able to communicate.
So it's kind of like how Latin worked in Europe way back when, right?
Mhm.
People needed a common tongue, something that went beyond their local dialects.
That's a great comparison. And just like how Latin influenced all those Romance languages, Spanish, French, Italian, you name it, this official Chinese language, based on northern dialects, really shaped what we now call Mandarin.
So fascinating how these things happen.
Mhm.
And it wasn't just the officials, right? This language must have had a huge impact on everything: trade, scholarship, everyday life.
Absolutely. Imagine you wanted to be in the mix, at the heart of Chinese society. Whether you're talking imperial courts or bustling marketplaces, knowing this common language, that was the ticket.
Made things a whole lot easier, I bet.
Oh, for sure. And that's actually where the word Mandarin comes in. When Jesuit missionaries showed up in the 16th century, they were blown away by this linguistic landscape. They saw how important this one language was and started using Mandarin based on the word for official to describe it.
It's so cool. Language really is about power, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And with Mandarin, that link is key to understanding how it all came to be. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Even though this official language was spreading, China's just so big, so geographically diverse that people's everyday speech didn't disappear. It kept evolving in its own way.
So it's like this official Mandarin at the top, but down at the street level, all these other dialects were alive and kicking.
Exactly. It'd be like, imagine, if you will, a map of China, right? But instead of just mountains and rivers, you've got all these crazy linguistic borders crisscrossing everywhere, each region with its own special flavor of Mandarin.
Like different versions of English popping up all over the United States.
That's a great way to put it. Each dialect with its own quirks, its own charm. And just like those regional differences in English, they got that way because of where they were located, who they traded with, even just the passing of time.
It's like this giant language family tree. Mandarin's the ancestor, and all these dialects are like the branches, each going off in its own direction.
You've got it. And like any family, some branches are closer than others. Like the dialects up north, closer to Beijing, those tend to sound a lot like what we think of as standard Mandarin today.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Like they were right there with the action, evolving alongside the language of the capital.
Exactly. But now let's head south for a bit, down to regions like, say, Sichuan or Yunnan, and suddenly the landscape changes. Mountains, valleys, they kind of section things off, you see.
Oh, so those dialects were more isolated. They got to do their own thing.
Precisely. And that's where things get really wild. We're talking sound changes so dramatic they can make your head spin. For someone who's used to that northern Mandarin, those southern dialects can sound like a totally different language.
No way.
Oh, yeah. Some sounds, like ones you hear in Beijing, down south, they transform into something else entirely.
Wow, I never would guessed. That's amazing, though. It really makes you appreciate just how much variety exists within Mandarin.
Absolutely. And we haven't even touched on the tones yet. You know those melodic ups and downs? Some southern dialects have even more than the 4 found in standard Mandarin.
Whoa, okay, you're really making me want to hear these dialects now. But before we get lost in all those sounds, I got to ask about these sound changes you mentioned. It's like each dialect holds a clue to how Mandarin evolved, right?
Exactly. And one of the most fascinating linguistic mysteries we find is, well, disappearing sounds.
Disappearing sounds.
Yeah.
Okay, now you got to tell me more.
Think of it like this. You have a word everyone used, but over time, people changed how they said it, little by little, until boom, it's gone. The original form vanished.
Like linguistic ghosts, huh? These echoes of words past. It's funny, the research actually gave a perfect example. 3 characters. Now, they all came from a similar place, etymologically speaking, but now they sound totally different.
It's true. And it's these vanishing sounds that give us a peek into Mandarin's own transformation. It's like each dialect is holding a piece of this massive puzzle. Linguists, they look at the differences and they start tracing those sounds back in time.
Like time travelers, but with words.
Right. They can actually rebuild words how they were pronounced centuries ago. It's incredible work. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, I think we got to talk about standardization. With all this variety we've been discussing, how on earth do you pick just one Mandarin?
It's a bit of a head scratcher, right? You have all these dialects, each one a part of the culture, the history of a region.
It's this balance, you see, a balancing act between keeping things distinct and that practical need to have everyone on the same page, especially in a place as huge and complex as China.
And that must have gotten even more important as China modernized, right?
Absolutely. Think about the early 1900s, huge upheaval, the Qing dynasty falls, nationalism is on the rise, a shared language. It starts to feel essential, a way to unify the country.
Right, bring everyone together. So
Yeah.
language became about more than just words. It was about a shared identity, a sense of nationhood.
Exactly. A standardized language makes communication easier, education, the economy, everything. At least that was the hope.
It makes sense, yeah. But how do you even begin to choose, with all those dialects, what makes one stand out? Why did Standard Chinese end up being what it is?
Oh, it wasn't easy, that's for sure. There were some real linguistic battles going on.
Oh, I love a good academic showdown. What were they saying?
Some scholars, they were all about building something totally new, a language from scratch, pulling bits and pieces from different dialects.
Like a Frankenstein's monster of language?
Kinda, yeah. But then others, they were adamant. We need to pick one dialect, make it official.
Yeah.
And the Beijing dialect, well, since it was spoken in the capital,
It had a certain prestige, right? Like the language of power.
for sure. But it wasn't just about practicality, was it? You've got different regions, each with its own history, its own sense of identity wrapped up in their dialect. Imagine being told, nope, your way of speaking, we're going with something else.
It'd be like losing a piece of yourself, almost. No wonder those debates got so intense.
They did. And honestly, in a way, those discussions haven't really stopped. But when it came down to it, that need for something practical, something everyone could use, and Beijing's political clout, that's what won out.
So in the end, it was Beijing's dialect that got the crown. But I imagine not everyone was thrilled.
Oh, you're right. While many saw it as a step forward, especially for progress and unity for others, particularly down south, it felt like their way of speaking, their heritage was getting pushed aside. It's a good reminder that language and power, they're intertwined.
So true. It shows how even something like making a language standard, it's never really neutral, is it? There's social baggage, cultural baggage, even political baggage that comes along.
Absolutely. And in China, that tension between keeping those regional dialects alive and having that one unified Mandarin, it's still shaping things today.
Makes you wonder what will happen to those other Mandarin dialects. Will they fade away or find a way to survive, even thrive, alongside Standard Chinese?
Great question. But before we go predicting the future of language, I think it's worth pointing out, even standardized Mandarin, it's not just a carbon copy of that Beijing dialect. It's got its own unique features.
So even the standard isn't set in stone.
Not at all. They took the Beijing dialect as a base, sure, but then they refined it, added elements from other dialects to make it clearer, more accessible to everyone. The goal was to make it truly national.
Like weaving together different threads to create a whole new tapestry.
Beautifully put. And this wasn't just about how people spoke. They also had to figure out the writing system.
Ah, right. Chinese characters. Each one is like a tiny work of art, but man, are they tough to learn.
They are. And just like with spoken Mandarin, there were differences in how those characters were written across China. Some places, especially in the South, they liked simpler forms, easier for everyday use. Other regions, they stuck with the more complex traditional characters.
So how do you choose? Which style gets to be standard?
Well, they kind of did both. That's what's so interesting. You have simplified characters, A&D traditional characters. Both are considered standard written Mandarin.
Okay, hold on. 2 standards. Tell me more.
So simplified characters, think of them like, well, simplified versions of the traditional ones. The People's Republic of China, they introduced these back in the mid-20th century. Big literacy
Make
push.
it easier for everyone to learn, right?
Exactly. Less intimidating, more people reading and writing, that was the goal. But then there's traditional characters. They've got this beauty to them, this history. Places like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, they still use them. A connection to the past.
It's fascinating. Even within standard Mandarin, there's this duality. It reflects all that complex history, all those political realities we talked about.
It really does. And it's not just mainland China and Taiwan either. Think about it. Mandarin's spoken all over the globe, right? From Chinatowns in North America to those huge Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. And every place it goes, it changes a bit.
It picks up new flavors along the way.
Exactly. And it's had a long history of borrowing from other languages, too. Take the languages spoken by nomadic groups up north, like Mongolian or Manchurian. Over centuries of trade, even conflict Mandarin picked up words, phrases you can hear their influence.
Wow, so languages really do collide, don't they? Sometimes they clash, sometimes they blend, but they're always changing each other.
That's it, exactly. And that same thing happened down south, too. Hokkien, Cantonese, even Malay all left their mark on Mandarin.
Creating these unique linguistic blends, like that Singarin you mentioned earlier.
Oh, yeah. Singapore's a great example. 4 official languages there, including Mandarin. But Singarin, it's like this cool mix of Mandarin structure with bits of English, Malay, Hokkien all mixed in.
Like a linguistic melting pot.
The perfect way to describe it. And these influences, they go deeper than just words, you know? Rhythm, melody, they change too. Some linguists even think that Cantonese, with its 6 tones, might have actually influenced how tones developed in certain Mandarin dialects.
That's fascinating. It just shows languages are always in conversation with each other,
Yeah.
borrowing ideas, sounds, even grammar.
Always. They're alive, dynamic, always evolving with the world around them. And just as Mandarin's been shaped by other languages, it's still changing from within. It's like those disappearing sounds we were talking about earlier.
Right, those little mysteries hidden within the language itself. Just goes to show that even within a single language family, change is inevitable. But hey, before we get too caught up in the past, I think we got to talk about those famous Mandarin tones.
Yes, they definitely deserve their own moment in the spotlight. But before we dive into that, it's worth remembering. While tones are often seen as the most challenging part of learning Mandarin,
They're also what gives Mandarin that musical quality, right? Like it's part of what makes it so unique.
absolutely, it's like adding this whole other dimension of meaning. It's not just the words themselves, but the music of how you say them.
Okay, so for anyone listening who's maybe new to this whole tone thing, could you give us a quick rundown? What are tones and how do they work in Mandarin?
Sure. So imagine each syllable is like a tiny little melody. It's got its own shape, its own ups and downs. We call these shapes tones, and they're just as important as the consonants and vowels when you're trying to figure out what a word means.
So you could have the same syllable, but change the tone, and suddenly it means something totally different.
You got it. Take the syllable ma, for instance.
Ma. Okay, got it.
Now, depending on the tone, that ma could mean mother, it could mean horse, it could even be a question like, what?
Oh, wow. That's a pretty big difference. No wonder people say tones are tricky.
They definitely take practice, that's for sure, but they're essential. It's like they're woven into the DNA of Mandarin.
All right, so let's break it down. We've got 4 main tones in standard Mandarin. Is that right?
4 main ones. Think of them like notes on a scale. You've got the first tone, nice and high and level, like holding a high note.
Okay, high level. Got it.
Then there's the second tone, which rises in pitch, kind of like when you ask a question. Yeah.
Oh, like really? Okay, I hear you.
And then the third tone, it dips low and then comes back up like a little wave.
Like it's going for a swim.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And finally, that fourth tone, it drops down sharply, like you're making a point.
Okay, I think I'm getting the hang of this.
Yeah.
So much meaning packed into those little melodies. And you mentioned earlier that these tone shapes can actually change a bit depending on the dialect.
That's right. Remember that family tree we were talking about?
Sure.
Well, think about how siblings might look alike, but they each have their own unique features, right?
Yeah.
Dialects are kind of like that. They might share those basic tones, but how they actually sound can vary a bit from place to place.
So a word might start high and stay high in one dialect, but in another it does a little dip or something.
Exactly. A great example is that third tone, the dipping, rising one. In some southern dialects, it'll sound more like it just dips low and stays there, no rise at the end.
Wow, that's amazing. How do people even keep it straight?
It's really a testament to the human brain, isn't it? We're hardwired to make sense of language, even when it gets a little messy. Context helps, and of course, if you grow up hearing these different dialects, you just develop an ear for it.
It's like being fluent in not just one Mandarin, but a whole bunch of them.
You could say that. And it speaks to this incredible diversity within the Mandarin-speaking world. But even with those regional differences, there's still this strong sense of connection, a shared heritage.
Right. Like at their core, they're all part of the same family, with roots that stretch back through time.
Exactly. And that shared heritage, it's not just about grammar or vocabulary, it's about the values embedded in the language itself.
Oh, that's interesting. Like what kind of values are we talking about?
Well, one that often stands out to people learning Mandarin is the way it shows respect for elders, for hierarchy. There are specific terms, pronouns you use depending on who you're talking to. You wouldn't address your boss or your grandma the same way you'd talk to a close friend.
It's like the language itself has manners built in.
In a way, it does. There's this whole system of honorifics and titles that reflects how important social order is in Chinese culture.
It makes you realize that language isn't just about getting information across, is it? It's about navigating relationships, showing respect, all those unspoken rules we have about how to treat each other.
Exactly. And another big one you see reflected in Mandarin is this emphasis on harmony, on indirect communication.
Oh, right, like people trying to avoid saying no directly or not being too confrontational so they don't upset anyone.
Precisely. It's not about being dishonest, but about keeping things harmonious, preserving relationships. Those are really important in Chinese culture.
It just goes to show, when you learn a language, you're not just learning words, are you? You're getting a glimpse into a whole other way of seeing the world.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's about cultural understanding as much as it is about language.
Well said. And wow, we've covered a lot of ground today. The history of Mandarin, those fascinating dialects, everything from disappearing sounds to those melodic tones.
It's been quite a journey through the world of Mandarin.
We've seen how it reflects Chinese culture, how it's evolved over time, how it's still changing, even today as it spreads across the globe.
Hopefully we've inspired a few people to go out and learn a little Mandarin themselves.
I hope so too. And to them I say, Jiyu,
Do you?
which for everyone who hasn't brushed up on their Mandarin yet means go for it. You got this.
It's the perfect phrase to end on, and it leads us to a final thought. If language is always changing, always adapting, like we've seen with Mandarin, what does that mean for how we'll communicate in the future, especially in a world that's more interconnected than ever?
That's a question worth pondering for sure. It's been a pleasure diving into this with you. Until next time.